Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review episode 4 of Superman and Lois. Ultimately, I would honestly say for this episode, I honestly feel in a very cryptic like sense, and we'll get into spoilers after a double 5 time count. I honestly feel that this episode was a little bit lighter, and I know that there might be some people that I think maybe after this episode may get a little bit restless with this show. Just like, okay, let's go somewhere with this show. Let's pick it up a little bit because ultimately, um, some people might say it's like, dude, 4 episodes and a little bit of action. Like, come on, let's pick it up a bit. Uh, if anything, yeah, there are some sequences that aren't exactly action packed, but have some event things going on, which could be interesting. But I think that this episode is just like, man, this is really getting light. Um, really getting light on the fact of like, okay, let's not focus so much on Jordan and Jonathan, and let's try and remember that this show is called Superman and Lois. Because it feels like there is too much focused on Jonathan and Jordan that we are basically almost forgetting that Lois and Superman are the title characters of the show. That kind of becomes obvious in this episode almost. It kind of feels like Superman and Lois are kind of an afterthought of the show. And it's like, okay, how can we just keep going along with Jonathan and Jordan, let's just say, in a very cryptic like sense? We end up having it to where General Sam ends up seemingly having a very important part of this role of this episode. And immediately, I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the fact that it seems that this character is kind of uh, really just kind of poking his head in and putting his 2 cents in. And then ultimately, the way that he is to end up in this episode, I'm like, oh, okay, of course. So, in other words, if he can't have his say, then there's another way that he can go about doing things to ultimately get what he wants or to otherwise uh, be who he has to be towards the end of this episode. I would say that reasonably, I'm going to otherwise try to hope that there isn't a point in time where ultimately there's some things in this episode that really don't seem really important. I think honestly the character who is consistently Morgan Edge on this show is probably the most irrelevant character of the show. Every time that he comes into the fray and does anything, I just immediately just go, yeah, every little bit of stuff that every little time the Morgan Edge is coming into here, immediately my ears go like this, dead silent, because I just don't care for this character. This character is really not important to me because it's not a Luthor. It's not a like. I'm not seeing Morgan Edge at all as a threat. I'm seeing him as a bathroom break. To be brutally honest, through this show, through these episodes. Like it seems like every time that this person is going to be in here, I'm like, oh, okay, so I don't care for the. I'm not going to care for this part. I'm not going to invest in this part of the episode because it's not going anywhere. It's not important enough. It's not vital enough to the show overall. Morgan Edge does nothing for me. He does nothing. It's like he did nothing down there in the whole brain department. So going on into this episode, I think that's all that I wanted to say in a very cryptic like sense. Basically, it didn't really seem at all we had any action whatsoever really going on in this episode. People will disagree, and I understand that because they'll say, well, no, what about that one part? And I'm like, that didn't feel like an action sequence to me. That that one scene that ultimately I'll talk about towards the tail end of this show, no action really going on there. So, speaking of action, let's get into action. Go and do spoilers about this episode. Spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this episode. So, Restless, yes. Uh, I think that there maybe needs to be a point in time where we just go, okay, how about we just spend a lot of time with Clark being Superman for one episode? How about we spend an entire time with both Superman and Jordan having to maybe pitch in a little bit or pitch hit, so to speak. Because ultimately we have a little bit going on in this episode, but not nearly enough. So let's go into it. So, spoilers. So we end up having it to where ultimately this episode again is seemingly focused on Jordan and Jonathan. Ultimately, we have it to where reasonably Clark is stepping in to be their assistant coach, and so ultimately they are at a football game, and we end up having it to where General Sam ultimately is like, you know what, hey, like I want to make my way to the football team or the football game because it's Jonathan's homecoming, like it's a special game and stuff like that, and so ultimately General Sam is to come on in to watch Jonathan play, and we end up having it to where Lois is just like, well, you never came to ending my games. It's like, yeah, and so I guess Sam, maybe in his much older age, I guess, is trying to make up for that through the eyes of his grandkids, I guess, because ultimately Lois is basically a lost cause, I guess. So we end up having it to where ultimately General Sam is ultimately noticing that, hey, Clark is the assistant coach, and what? Jordan is playing football? Interesting. And so we end up having it to where ultimately Jordan's coach is ultimately telling him, like, man, I'm relying on you. Like, all this on you right now. Come on, go for it. And so ultimately Jordan goes out to ultimately go and, of course, just run through everybody, tackle the quarterback. The ball falls out. Um, the Smallville team ends up getting the ball, making their way downfield, and touchdown. So we end up having it to ultimately, after this game is over, Sam is ultimately ridiculing both Clark and Lois about their parenting skills. Ultimately saying like, dude, like your son is like lighting people up onto the field, like, and he's like 120 pounds soaking wet. Like, wouldn't people figure out that ultimately he's Superboy or whatever? Like, wouldn't he be able to figure? Wouldn't anybody be able to figure out how bizarrely this kid is now like a superstar on the football field? And ultimately, General Sam is ultimately saying like, yeah, it's nice that Clark is otherwise taking time out for his sons, but ultimately he needs every second of time to ultimately be anywhere at any point in time. And how is Clark going to be able to balance being a father and protecting the planet? Because we ultimately have it to where General Sam is ultimately mentioning how, with Clark's absence in Metropolis, it's kind of leaving Metropolis to be unsafe. To ultimately, they are going to have to start to transport certain villains around because really Metropolis seems like a I guess what would be called in hockey terms an open net for anybody to come on down and ultimately just start a ruckus because Clark isn't there to defend it 24/11. So we end up having it to where eventually Clark is getting upset with Sam, ultimately arguing back and forth about how like Clark can be a father and be a Superman. Like, and so we eventually have it to where Lois kind of butts in and kind of basically tells her father off, basically mentioning it's like, well, hey, like, you just want your 2 cents and everything. Like, basically, when looking at it, basically, General Sam almost thinks that Clark is basically his property or is his uh, like he wants him to be available 24/7 for General Sam, like at every second of every day of every whatever. And ultimately it's like, well, hey, if a tree falls and no one's around, then it's kind of that analogy of just like, oh well, like if Superman isn't awake 24 hours a day for any number of things, like some accidents are bound to happen. Um, Basically, then hire 12 Supermans and like find 12 Supermans out there and freaking so that way somebody can take the night shift, someone can take the day shift. I don't know how many superheroes at some point made their way to Metropolis. Like, come on, like if anything, when someone is to leave some city, there's probably going to be bound to be superhero uh, superhero plan B. Otherwise, just like, oh great, Superman's now gone. I'm gonna be here then. How many millions of like Justice League members do they have? Especially when you look at a cartoon show like Justice League Unlimited, where there's basically like bajillions upon bajillions of superheroes that are all in a satellite up in the sky somewhere. Basically, it's the same. It's basically like, well, satellite in the sky, so otherwise anybody can just be booming down to at any second help out Metropolis. So again, what are they? What does Metropolis need Superman for? When looking at all of those things in a grand scheme spectrum, and so on and so forth. So going on into here, we ultimately seemingly have it where Lois is ultimately saying that General Sam is ultimately wanting his 2 cents and he wants to be so controlling with everything. And we ultimately have it to where eventually the general is like, you know what? Well, maybe I should be more part of this family. Maybe I'm realizing that I'm not a part enough of this family. And so we end up having it to where eventually Sam ultimately seems to spend a little bit more time with the family, ultimately telling both Jordan uh, and Jonathan. And I know I'm kind of skipping around a lot of stuff, but there's a point to all that. Just to kind of skip around to ultimately kind of get to a lot of points and everything like that. So we end up having a tour eventually. We end up having General Sam ultimately going in to talk to Jonathan and Jordan, ultimately to tell them it's like, hey, like, realize how important your father's time is. Yeah, like, it's great that he's spending time with you, but ultimately, when realizing it, like, don't go and call him because maybe you forgot the stove was on. Like, make sure that when you're going to call your father, it's for a real legitimate emergency. Like basically, like if you think the world's gonna end, then call him. So that is honestly kind of dumb because we end up finding out that seemingly there is a kid named Tag who ultimately is starting to show some signs of superpower. It seems that he is having some vibrational like shaking like power consistently to where you're just consistently seeing him consistently shake. It seems like this kid ultimately Tag he is a part of the football team, but he had gotten injured. He had broken his arm during that campfire. Ultimately, Jordan had lit up that campfire and caused, I guess, a guy like Tag to ultimately go and get superpowers. It seems that there was also like it wasn't exactly all heat vision and fire. Like it was some also element in there. So I'm wondering if eventually we're gonna get a bunch of other teen kids to have superpowers because of that fire of what Jordan started. To where ultimately Jordan is probably going to regret ever causing that fire to explode the way it did. So we end up having it to where Tag is eventually going and uh, like taking off his cast because ultimately he had broken his hand and he took off his cast. And so eventually we notice that Tag's hand is starting to shake. And eventually, the further on we go into here, we eventually start to see Tag's body, like his entire body, all of a sudden start to consistently shake. And we eventually have it to where Jonathan is to eventually notice Tag's shaking, and ultimately we end up having it to where uh, Clark is to go in to talk to Jonathan, and ultimately Clark ultimately has to leave because there is a villain called Kilgrave that is ultimately getting transported via Metropolis. And so we end up having it to where Jonathan ultimately is not able to tell his father, it's like, hey, this guy's shaking. Like, this guy is super shaking. And so, really, I think Jonathan eventually blows it off because ultimately he's like, maybe I didn't quite see what I thought I saw. So, we end up having it to where there's a transport going on of this guy, Kilgrave. It seems that we eventually find out that this Kilgrave character seems to be a wild card Ash like character. It seems like he has the ability to MacGyverly be able to come up with any kind of thing to get him out of sticky situations. It seems that ultimately we have Kilgrave going through this transport, and it seems that ultimately he is chewing on some bubblegum, which we believe. Eventually, we end up having it to where Kilgrave ends up spitting out this gum onto this wall, and we end up having Kilgrave explaining that this gum that he had spit out isn't actually gum. It's actually some device to where it could get him out of this situation, this door, this whatever. And so we end up having Kilgrave eventually escaping from uh, this prison car to ultimately have it to where there are goons awaiting to help Kilgrave escape. So we end up having it to where ultimately Superman is to go to uh, intercept Kilgrave escaping, and he ends up finding a little bit of a device that ultimately is to have Kilgrave talk to him in a past tense to ultimately say like, "Hey, soups" or whatever he ends up saying. So we end up going on into eventually having Superman eventually trying and intercepting Kilgrave yet again by him trying to find out Kilgrave's location, and it ends up finding out that uh, that location ultimately has Kilgrave sneaking up behind Superman with a sonic weapon of sorts. To where ultimately we end up having it to where, and I'll get to the Lois Lane stuff eventually. It'll be a thing that we'll get into. So we end up having it to where Kilgrave is blasting Superman with this sonic ray, which is not really an action sequence. It's just hey gun, but hey, isn't that great? So we end up having it to where Kilgrave ultimately seems to have the one up on Superman, but eventually we have it to where Superman tries to like fly against Kilgrave, but ultimately we end up having it to where that doesn't quite work. Kilgrave ends up blasting him anyways and kind of knocks Superman back. Eventually, we have it to where Superman ends up doing the Hulk clap, where ultimately that clap ends up um, knocking out any number of people, but also knocking out Kilgrave. Ultimately, Superman ends up giving a call to ultimately say, "Hey, yeah, you guys want to come and pick up Kilgrave here? He's knocked out." So, because we end up having it to ultimately, uh, while that is going on, we end up having it to where both Jonathan and Jordan are seemingly at a party, and we end up finding out that one, Jordan, while talking to Sam, is ultimately mentioning how both of them seemingly have gone through a drastic change in their lives. Ultimately, Sarah leaving cheerleading, and ultimately Jordan ultimately becoming a jock, where ultimately neither one of them like have that kind of like neither one of them should be doing either one of those kinds of things because they're kind of like outcasts or whatever, or really Sarah had come into being an outcast, where ultimately Jordan had come from being out of a outcast. Ultimately, we end up having it to where Sarah ultimately asked Jordan, "Hey, do you like football?" kind of thing, and ultimately Jordan says, "Well, yeah, like it's actually giving me less anxiety, and ultimately I'm really loving the camaraderie of things." And like, dude, didn't we just ask Jordan like the episode before this if he liked football from the perspective of Clark? Ultimately asking him, like, what are we gonna do this every episode? Where ultimately Lois is ultimately gonna ask Jordan, "Hey, do you like football? Do you like it? Do you like football now?" Uh, cause like we're asking him this question like every episode. So we end up having it to our tag is ultimately going and shaking, and he is trying to steady himself by grabbing onto a piece of furniture, and when he shakes he breaks that piece of furniture off, which gets someone who ultimately is throwing this party to be angry because it's like, dude, you know how expensive that table is. So we end up having it to where ultimately Tag is to almost get into a fight, and Tag is trying to prevent showing his powers. But eventually, we end up having it to where Tag ultimately tries to leave the party to hide his powers away. So we end up having to where both Jordan and Jonathan end up going and running after him. Ultimately, like, "Hey, guy, hey, like, what's going on? Like, there's something going on with you." And so we end up seeing Tag in the forest just shaking like crazy. And so we end up having it to where ultimately Jordan tries to grab onto him to try and like with uh, with Jordan's super speed and Tag's super like Jordan is trying to like steady him down to try to like see if he can ultimately try to like stop him from shaking with his super speed, but that just ends up taking Jordan and just shooting him off from Tag and flinging him off because he can't keep um, he can't keep uh, Tag steady. And so we eventually have it to where Jordan is like, "Dude, we have to call Dad. Like, this guy is otherwise like destroying all kinds of parts of this forest, ultimately like trying to keep himself steady. So we have to call Dad." So Jordan ends up taking the device, or Jonathan ends up taking the device and calling Dad. And so that is while Clark is ultimately dealing with Kilgrave, and so that's why he immediately tries to incapacitate Kilgrave to fly his way as quickly as possible to his sons to take care of Tag. We end up having it to where Clark ends up um, uh, taking Tag into basically orbit, almost into space, so that way Tag uh, could ultimately, while the air is thinner, he can calm down. And so we end up having that moment resolved, and to where ultimately we end up having it to where uh, General Sam ends up mentioning what is to go on with Tag. Hey, yeah, like, um, they are going to send him off into a special school for superheroes or for superpower people, and ultimately Jonathan's like, hey, like, there's seriously a school for superpower people, and General Sam is like, well, yeah, but it's super secret. So we end up and he says classified, but I say super secret because I think it's funnier. Um, so we end up having it to where um, Clark ultimately is upset with Jonathan Jordan of why that they didn't right away call him immediately when this trouble was happening. And ultimately, like, Jonathan Jordan are kind of looking at General Sam as like, yeah, because someone told us not to. So we end up having it to where the whole argument about General Sam kind of outstepping his bounds, all that rigmarole, kind of what I said earlier. So, what is also going on with Lois in this episode? So, Lois ultimately is to go and start doing her news reporting with the Smallville reporter, and we end up finding Morgan Edge going and saying, yeah, she cannot write one little bit of any article. And so we end up having to where Lois is like, well, okay, since I can't write anything, then I'll otherwise try and get Morgan Edge out of his ability to control his town. And ultimately, I think if I use Clark Kent as a local boy that ultimately has some say in this town to go into this meeting to ultimately sway the opinion of Lois instead of Morgan Edge. I'm like, that's why I'm like, Lois needs to just run for office or something in this thing. Like, if she can't write any articles anyways, why not just run for political office? Might as well. Like, she can kind of talk her way into out debate people. So when looking at it, she can run for office if that's really what she wanted to do. So we end up having it to ultimately Lois is to go to this town meeting to otherwise try to sway people with Clark Kent, but Clark never shows because Clark ultimately ends up getting busy. And so we end up having to where Lois is ultimately egg on her face, just going like, crap, I don't have Clark here, so I don't have my trump card to ultimately sway people's opinions. So everything ends up going up Morgan Edge. So we end up having it to where reasonably Clark is otherwise just upset of the fact that ultimately he wasn't there for Lois because he's never really quite there for Lois. And Lois can really understand because she's like, no, like, I understand that you're trying to be here for our sons, and I understand that you're trying to also be Superman, and I understand that that could be very difficult. Um, and so, but we end up having it to where Clark otherwise apologizes to her and ultimately tries to uh, put together a really nice dinner for her. But eventually he ends up having to forcibly leave regardless because General Sam ends up calling Lois to ultimately say, hey, yeah, like, I'm calling to confirm to you that, hey, Clark needs to go and uh, try and prevent something that hasn't quite bubbled up yet. And so, like, I think that's kind of a nice gesture on General Sam's part. But when looking at it, I just think that General Sam is just really just upset because really he can't control Clark. Since he can't control him, he's going to kill him. That is just the most bizarrest thing possible. Because when looking at it, General Sam is seeing the medallion um, of the numbered symbolish black symbol of Superman, medallion thing, and considering General Sam can't get his way, he is calling to ultimately mention that they are going to put together a project with this with the numbers of the back of that medallion as the project name. So we are going to have it to our ultimate at some point. General Sam is quite possibly going to turn on Superman, and it is going to get ugly. What we are to assume to happen on this episode. But I want to get out of here, so ultimately I can try to make this episode as quick as done as possible. Yeah, this episode felt really light, but also I kind of rushed through a lot of things, and just to try to get this all out of the way and done. But anyways, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.